So there won't be anything on the exam which commences with the material from next week. Okay? Yeah. Any other clarifications that anybody requires regarding the midterm? All right. What we will do today, I'm going to take a few minutes to wrap up some comments that I had made, some observations, continue with some observations that I had made in my previous lecture. And you recall that what we had been talking about is the Anglicist-Orientalist Controversy and the piece by Macaulay. And I think I had mentioned to you in that lecture that I was going to discuss another piece at some length, because one of the practices that we are engaged in is looking both at the larger picture and then looking at a number of texts a bit closely, so you learn how to read the text, you know. Okay, so we will look at one more text, and then I'm going to move to this picture over here, the scenario that unfolds when we begin to look at these modalities and forms of knowledge, and the rest of the lecture will be on this, because I'm going to attempt to go through this systematically. We may not be able to do all of it, but you'll get a pretty good idea of what's really entailed. Right? And let me put the questions to you again in a very broad framework. And this applies both to the close reading of the text that we're going to look at, as well as this larger scenario that I've laid out for you here. The questions we're interested in this week, going into next week. So part of the lecture next week, the first lecture next week, will be on this subject, and then we'll return to that political history that we had been looking at in previous lectures. Okay, and we're going to be entirely caught up by the end of the next lecture. We will be exactly where we ought to be in the syllabus. I'm just letting you know so that you have some idea of where we are. All right. So the larger question is that we are interested here in the conquest of knowledge. Right? Who produces knowledge, and for whom? And when we look at, let's say, British colonialism, and again, the same arguments could be made apropos of, let's say, French colonialism, right? So, for example, a huge compendium that was produced under Napoleon on Egypt. When Egypt falls under French rule, the French are going to produce this massive compendium of information. All right? So this enterprise of producing knowledge about the other, about the people that you colonize, this is not, of course, particular to the British in India. I was only trying to suggest to you that this enterprise may be more advanced if you look at the British in India. Seems to be much more systematic in some ways. But we are also interested in the question of what is the relationship between the knowledge that is produced in India and the knowledge that is produced in Britain itself. So you should not walk away with the impression that this massive compendium of information that the British were accumulating about India is something that they do only in India. They do it back in Britain itself. For example, the Statistical Survey of Scotland in 21 volumes, which was done in the early part of the 19th century, 21 volumes. And incidentally, this is where, you know, these words mean something very different than what they mean today. If I ask you what's the meaning of statistics, you know, you'll think obviously of numbers, and you'll think of a branch of mathematics, shall we say, okay? Right? But Statistical Survey of Scotland is not simply an enumeration of numbers. And that's what's called the enumerative modality, you know, where you start dealing with numbers of all kinds. And then there are different regimes of enumeration, as you'll see. But the Statistical Survey of Scotland is essentially a massive compendium of information on the flora and the fauna, you know, the animals, the minerals, the coastline, so forth and so on. Right? So statistical here, it refers, as I said, not just to numbers, but it refers to a whole intellectual apparatus for dealing with a particular place. And this is the Enlightenment Project. So that's the backdrop that you have to think about. What do I mean when I say the Enlightenment Project? What I mean by that, in part, is this idea that the world is knowable. Right? So the world is external to you, you are the viewer, you are the subject, and then there's this world out there that is knowable. And how do you comprehend this world? You comprehend it today through different disciplines. So if you were interested in the economic activity of people, you become an economist. Well, that's a charitable interpretation of what economists do, perhaps, because most of the time they're actually just creating models, frankly. All right? So forth and so on. You could describe what each discipline does. One thing I want you to bear in mind is that most of the academic disciplines in their present form were shaped under the rubric of colonialism. Right? So, which is one reason why this becomes important, because it's a way of understanding not only what the British were doing in India and what forms of knowledge they were producing in India, to know the Indian, as it were. These forms of knowledge are actually critical in developing what we might describe as a Western academy. Anthropology. What is anthropology, for example? Right? So if you had to, and what's the difference, let's say, between anthropology and sociology? Right? So sociology is when you study your own people. I'm giving it to you in a very, very cryptic form. So let's say you were interested in the nature of ghetto life in South Central Los Angeles. Who would study that? The person who would study that would usually be called a sociologist in the United States. When you're studying your internal others, so to speak, okay? And these internal others are constituted by divisions of race and class, so forth and so on, right? When you study the other, external other, as it were, and in anthropology, or if you look at the anthropologists who became prominent in the early 20th century, most of them were studying people that, quote, would have been described as primitive in some fashion or the other. So you study people living in Melanesia or Polynesia or Africa. All right? So the anthropologists were studying the external other. And that's a rough and ready distinction. We are not being precise about it because obviously we could sit down and look at the contours of each discipline. But anthropology is a purely colonial discipline. It is formed entirely under colonialism. I mean, you could say that there were people who were doing works of history. For example, in Elizabethan England, in the mid-16th century, people develop a taste for what is called history. So history is not a discipline shaped entirely under the rubric of colonialism, but anthropology certainly is. And most disciplines, in fact, were shaped under the rubric of colonialism. So when we begin to look at the colonial forms of knowledge, modalities of knowledge, what I'm suggesting to you is a number of things here. One, that it is not simply a matter of acquiring an intellectual understanding of colonialism vis-a-vis India, right? I'm suggesting to you that, in fact, it tells us a great deal about how we arrive at an understanding of phenomena, of societies, and that this understanding becomes the bedrock of the modern academy as we know it today. And secondly, I'm suggesting you, related to the first point, that this was an Enlightenment ambition. The Enlightenment ambition is the whole world is knowable. You can master it. You can know it. Okay? And in fact, to give you an illustration of just what are the consequences of this, I want to tell you a little anecdote. And it will take you straight to the museological modality as well. So about 10 years ago, I went to the Holocaust Museum in Los Angeles. Right? And I don't know how many of you have been to either this Holocaust Museum or any other Holocaust Museum. They all have a similar structure. What is a structure? The exhibition will usually begin with Jewish life, for example, let's say in Germany, in the late 19th century. The history of anti-Semitism in Europe, because you know that there's a long history of anti-Semitism in Europe. It didn't start in the 1930s, obviously, right? It will start with that, and then it will eventually go on to what happened in World War I, where Germany lost the war, and then you have the Treaty of Versailles, and when the Treaty of Versailles is written, Germany feels that it has been wronged, because there are these heavy burdens that are imposed upon Germany as penalty, right? Reparations, so forth and so on. Then after that, it moves to the Weimar Republic, and eventually the coming to power of the Nazis under Hitler. And then by 1933, the Nazi party is supreme. You have the Reichstag fire, all of that. This is a typical, and then of course it leads to eventually, overt acts of discrimination against Jews in Germany, the buildup of the war machine, the war, right? The concentration camp, the final solution, right? And then the liberation of the camps, right, at the end of World War II. That's your typical display. Now, this museum, at the end of it, had what was by far the most chilling display that I could think of. And completely unexpected. The Nazi regime, the ideologues of the Nazi regime, okay, the theorists of race, superiority, the feeling of racial superiority and so forth. That's what I mean by the ideologues. Okay? The ideologues of the Nazi regime had an idea that once they had wiped out the Jewish race, which is what the final solution is. You want to wipe out every single Jewish person if you can. And there's an interesting debate in the Holocaust literature about, whether the outcome of the war might have been a little bit different, perhaps, if Germany had not been so obsessed under the Nazis. Even when they were losing the war, they were still diverting a large part of their resources towards the elimination of the Jews. And it's been argued that this, in fact, is quite important. That, because if you're losing the war, you would think that, all right, we're going to put all our resources into fighting the war. But in fact, a large part of their resources are still being diverted to ensure that the final solution is carried out. Okay? So what is this exhibit? This last exhibition, what is it about? That the idea was that once the war had ended and the Jewish race had been eliminated, then in Berlin they were going to build a grand museum of, guess what? What do you think it would be?
Jewish culture.
Jewish history and culture. Now that's an astounding idea. So you want to wipe out every single Jewish person, right? And yet you want to build a grand museum to Jewish history and culture. Why would you do that? Right? Yes?
Because you can control the narrative.
You can control the narrative, yes, of course. But you see the irony of it, right? The irony is that you don't want to deal with the living specimens of a culture, you only want to deal with the dead specimens of a culture. What is a museum? It is the fossil record of humanity. By which I mean, not that every museum has dinosaurs in it, the museums of natural history do, but every museum is, in a manner of speaking, a dinosaur. It is a dinosaur because what is it? It's the fossil record, a complete record. If you put it all together, what do museums do? They give you a complete record of the human experience, right? So part of the human experience is, yes, there was a group of people called the Jews. Imagine that the final solution had been achieved. That every Jewish person that the Nazis at least and their friends and supporters could lay their hands on had been eliminated. And there are groups of people, by the way, that have been eliminated to the last person. I hope you know that. The Tasmanian Aboriginals is the best example. By the 1840s, the Tasmanian Aboriginals have been wiped out. And there's a whole story about the last Tasmanian Aboriginal who is then sort of, she survives until the 1860s, 1870s, but that's it. And then she's going to be taken to, she's basically a museum piece because she is a curiosity. The last Tasmanian, all right? And it is not made up. I mean, there's plenty of evidence and there's agreement on what happened to the Tasmanian Aboriginals, completely wiped out. The Tasmanian Aboriginals are different from other Aboriginal groups because if you go to Australia, there are many different Aboriginal groups. And so the Tasmanian Aboriginals, of course, different because Tasmania, as you know, is not part of the Australian mainland. It's separated, right? That's a long history. The point here, I hope you're seeing what the point is. The point here is that this idea of the museum, for example, right? So you eliminate the Jews, but let's have a museum where you can learn everything you could possibly want to know about Jewish history and culture. Right? Why would you want to do that if you've wiped out the entire race? You would want to do that for the same reason that we want to know about dinosaurs. Just because they don't exist anymore doesn't mean that we don't want to know about them. Right? You see, but it's an unusual kind of perversion, if you ask me, to think that way. That's what I'm trying to suggest to you. That these are not innocuous enterprises. Now somebody in this room might well say to me, well, we can't possibly interpret, can we, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art this way? What does that have to do with, the sort of things that you're talking about? Now, I'm not saying, obviously, that all museums are alike. We're interested in the idea of the museum. Okay? The theory, as it were. What does the institution of the museum mean? Is it an institution that every group of people everywhere in the world naturally have thought is the most desirable way of understanding their relationship to a body of knowledge? A museum encompasses a certain body of knowledge. Right? Some cultures, frankly, don't have, if I may put it this way, a real relationship with the museum. If I go to the National Museum, okay, in Delhi, on a Sunday morning, there'll probably be 20 people there. 20 people. If I go on a weekday morning, there'll be busloads of children who have all been brought there forcibly, and I've actually seen this. I mean, they see the whole museum in 10 minutes. So basically a matter of recording the fact that you took them there, because this way you can see, yeah, you gave them a dose of something called culture, Nobody in India is even remotely interested in museums. If I go to the British Museum on a Sunday, I can't even get in. I mean, it's packed. Tens of thousands of people, or the Smithsonian, tens of thousands of people are going in. Different civilizations experience art and culture in different ways. All right? So now the question for us will become, this is only an illustration of one form of knowledge. Museum is a form of knowledge. Right? So what were the forms of knowledge that were produced in colonial India? What do they tell us about India, if anything? What do they tell us about the Enlightenment aspiration? That everything external to you can be mastered. Right? This is what we are interested in. And I'm suggesting to you that this conquest of knowledge is, in fact, always much more enduring than the physical conquest. At some point in time, the physical occupation of the land ends. The British are no longer in India. Right? The British are no longer in India, but that intellectual legacy is something that persists down to the present day and will continue to persist for a period of time. And then we have to understand their consequences. All right? But before we get to this larger picture in a bit more detail now, I've given you the larger framework here. What I want to do is just simply make a few more observations about the Anglicist-Orientalist Controversy, and then move on to this other text, which when I sent you that email on Monday, I had said to you, there's this text called The Effeminacy of the Inhabitants of Hindustan. I want you to look at that text carefully. All right? So I want to look at that text with you. The Anglicist-Orientalist Controversy, essentially you have the picture. The picture is that you have the Anglicists, in this case, who's leading the charge? The charge of the Light Brigade, as it were. It's Macaulay. And who is Macaulay? He's a historian, in fact, actually, by the way. He's not only a member of the Law Council, he also writes a history of England. All right? So he's obviously somebody who's quite learned, right, and interested in literature, history, philosophy, and he becomes a member of the Viceroy's Council. And then he is going to be charged with producing policy having to do with education. But one thing I want you to bear in mind is that we should not assume that people like Macaulay were simply interested in forcing English literature upon Indians. In fact, there's a lot of ambivalence about this. He's very forcible about what it is that he does want to force upon Indians, but it's not English literature. Why is it not English literature? Okay? Because, for example, who would be the paragon of English literature? Shakespeare. The problem with Shakespeare is that, I don't know how many of you, I'm sure all of you have familiarity with one play at least. It might be Macbeth, it might be Hamlet, it might be Othello, Julius Caesar. Might be one play. But if you, whichever play it is, especially we're speaking about the tragedies, okay? Especially the tragedies. Whichever play it is that you're familiar with, I think on a moment's reflection, you will agree that the characters in Shakespeare's plays, many of them are not models for good behavior, shall we say. Okay? They are not models for righteous conduct. Right? I mean, there are just too many people in Shakespeare's plays, you know, who are either murdering other people or lying or they're deceitful. Right? Now, this is a problem, because if you want to teach Indian kids, all right, English literature, you cannot teach them Shakespeare, because they're going to learn things that they ought not to be learning about. Right? What you really want to be, the person you want to have perhaps as your model is, let's say, Milton. Except that Milton is very difficult, all right, and then of course it means deeply steeped in Christian theology, deeply steeped in Paradise Lost, right? So that's not an appropriate text, obviously, right? So you see what the problem here is now, that do not think that because Macaulay is an Anglicist, therefore he has a view that all of English literature is, he may think that it's great literature. That's not what's being disputed. Shakespeare may be great literature, but it's not appropriate, right? Because part of the enterprise for Indian children, because part of the enterprise here is that you want to instill certain kinds of values. And of course the evangelical lobby is very strong now. Right? So you remember that I told you about the 4 theories of governance, and I said that there's a utilitarian school and then there's the evangelical school. And the evangelical school, the difference between them and the utilitarians is precisely the view that we are a Christian power, let us be candid about it, let us recognize it, and therefore it means that Christian education should be instilled in the children in India. Right? And this is where you're going to get a divergence of views, because some people are going to say, no, what we really want to do is we want to instill the values of Western secularism, right? And so one of my concluding remarks the other day was, right, I want to underscore that if you look at the relations between India and England, okay, so I want to make 2-3 points here, keep them separate. The first is that the colony and the metropole, that is London, okay, England as a whole, but London in particular, this is a unitary field of analysis. You should not view these as separate. I can tell you, by the way, people who study British history, 95%, and that's probably being generous, I would probably say 99%, 95% of people who study British history, they study British history as though Britain did not have any colonies. You know, that colonialism, yeah, it's something there. Yeah, we know that Britain was in India and it was in Africa, but 95% of historians of Britain who study British history, they do not include a real discussion of what Britain was doing abroad, its whole empire. You know, empire was just something incidental in a way. So you still study British history as though, you know, the only thing that really mattered were what was happening in England itself. You know, what the Tories were doing, what the, Labour Party, well, there was no Labour Party as such, you know, in the 19th century, not in the present shape and form. But what political parties were doing, what was the nature of interaction of British politics, so forth and so on. Okay? Class relations in Britain. If you're studying India, on the other hand, in the 19th century, right, it is imperative that we keep in mind what's happening in Britain as well. Right? That's what I mean by the unitary field of analysis. And to understand that unitary field of analysis, think about what are the institutions that were developed in India then went on to Britain. That was my concluding comment to you on Tuesday, right? That we should be thinking not only about how Britain shaped India, but how tacitly there were certain things that were developed in India under British rule, which then went back to Britain. So, for example, the idea of competitive civil service exams. This was first deployed in India. And you know that if, as an Indian, you wanted to become a member of the Indian civil service, that is, that you want to become a part or the governing elite to govern your own country, you'll be surprised to know that as an Indian, you could not sit for the Indian civil service exam in India. You had to go all the way to London to do that. So you can see it meant that is going to exclude virtually all Indians, including elite Indians, because it would mean a long passage all the way to England to be able to sit for a civil service exam. And if you are successful, then you can help in governing your own country, right? But the competitive civil service exams were first established in India, and then this idea was taken over to Britain, and then they started having competitive civil service exams for their own civil services. Okay, the police force, crowd control. One of the things that any police force is fundamentally interested in is a question of crowd control. How do you control a crowd? So, riots break out, there's a mob, as it's called. How do you control it? These techniques were perfected by the police force in India, and then these techniques are used in England themselves. That's what I mean by the institutions and practices going from the colony to the metropole. Now, with respect to education, which is a subject on which that we've been on, the most interesting illustration of that is the fact that the idea that you had to introduce a rigorously scientific kind of curriculum is developed by the British in India. And the reason for that is that they thought that Indians are especially superstitious because the two dominant religions are Hinduism, the two dominant religions are Hinduism and Islam. And from their point of view, both of these groups of people are ridden by superstition. Right, that the faculty of reason hardly exists among these people, and so therefore now we have to give them an especially heavy dose of science. If you give them an especially heavy dose of science, you hope they'll come away with a little bit, at least. Right? And so especially heavy dose of science meant that your educational curriculum had to be cast in excessively secular terms. Okay? And this is one of the arguments that is developed by Gauri Vishwanathan in her book, Masks of Conquest. Right? So when we're looking at the Anglicist-Orientalist controversy, it's not simply a matter of saying that the Anglicists were in favor of Western education. Yes, they were. Okay? But they are in favor of education in the English medium. Right? And then some within that camp will say, well, that cannot be a solution for the entire country. Right? Because English is a completely alien language. So what we have to do is we have to make sure, yes, we agree that they should not be reading their scriptures because all of that is superstition. Right? But some within the Anglicist camp will say that what is important is that we develop a kind of a scientific secular curriculum in Indian languages, non-classical Indian languages such as Hindi, Bengali, Kannada, so forth and so on. Okay, so that's the division within the Anglicist camp. And then, of course, another point of that division is that some are firmly rooted to the idea, which is more or less a variation of what I've said to you, that it's imperative that you keep Christian education out of it. Because if you introduce the Christian framework, that is going to alienate some of our subjects. Okay? And then, of course, the Orientalist position, you already know, it's less complicated in that sense. The gist of it is that when this minute is written by Macaulay, it is going to change the nature of the discourse in India. All right? Because what you're going to find is that the consequences of the minute are that the state will expend its funds now on English medium education, largely on English medium education. Okay? Let me now turn very briefly to this other text, okay, by Robert Orme. And so who is Robert Orme? Robert Orme is officially the historiographer of the East India Company. He's officially appointed historiographer of the East India Company. That's not what he is when he first arrives, when he first arrives in India, first starts writing about India. Right? He's going to be appointed historiographer later on, and in turn what it means when he's appointed historiographer of the East India Company, what that means is that he's going to provide official narratives about right? The history of India and leading up to the conquest by the British. Okay? So this particular essay is from a book called Fragments, Some Historical Fragments of the Mughal Empire. This particular essay that I'm talking about called Effeminacy of the Inhabitants of Hindustan. Now, the title, 1761, the title itself is extraordinary. So, you know, it would be like writing an essay, imagine, Effeminacy of American citizens in total, right? So what the title itself is quite revealing, because what he's really saying is, let me translate it to you in a different language. There are no men in India. There are no men, essentially. Okay? Because their men are all like women. They're all soft, they're tender, they're weak, they're passive, assuming, by the way, that these were all qualities that women had. Right? You see, so that's a different set of problems here, because it assumes that, well, you associate men with certain things, you know, rationality, right? Okay, etc., etc., and then you associate women with other sets of things, or other sets of characteristics. And one of the things I do want to say is that some of these assumptions that he makes are assumptions that were routinely made about women in Europe as well. So, you know, there are passages where he describes women as, let me point your attention to the passage, okay? So this is on page 301 of the text. So here he's describing the women of Hindustan. You know, Hindustan is the name for India, right? Okay. And I quote, "Nature seems to have showered beauty on the fairer sex throughout Hindustan with a more lavish hand than in most other countries." Yeah, so the women there are more attractive than they are elsewhere. However, now, they are all, without exception, fit to be married before 13. Right? They are all fit to be married before 13 and wrinkled before 30. So that's their lifespan. Between 13 and 30 is, you know, when they're in full bloom, and that's it. Right? These are his words. They are all, without exception, fit to be married before 13 and wrinkled before 30. Flowers of too short a duration not to be delicate, and too delicate to last long. Okay, so one thing you have to keep in mind is that this kind of description is not in itself unique to the women of India. That's how you would have written about the women in your own country. You know, they're delicate, they're like flowers, etc., etc. All right? Of course, here in India, it's aggravated, because Indian women are hyper-feminine. You see, if all the men are like women, then what about the women? It's not like the men are like, that the women are like men, not at all, of course. There are no men, remember, right? So when we say effeminacy, this is a characterization of men. Women cannot be effeminate, by definition, so to speak. Only men can be effeminate, because to be effeminate is for a man to display characteristics or qualities more particular to women, right? So we say so-and-so, oh, he's, you know, Robert's really effeminate. You know, Robert's got characteristics too akin to that of a woman, right? So if the men are like women, what are the women? The women are hyper-feminine, essentially, right? That's what he's going to do in this text. So if you look through the text, what he's creating here is a certain trope. And this is where you have to go back to the whole idea of Orientalism, because one of the things I was suggesting to you is that Orientalism is a discourse about the other, right? And this discourse has certain characteristic features. So what you do is you say, well, we can summarize this entire civilization, and we can do it by saying that these are the tropes that characterize a civilization. So the natives are lazy. So for example, with respect to the question of productivity, why is the land not so productive in India? Because on the whole, the people there are lazy. Or will mention you a number of other things, you know, that, hey, the soil is such that you don't have to labor very hard. So for those of you who read the essay, you will know that he makes a distinction between people who eat rice and people who eat wheat, and then we can add people who eat corn and people who eat potatoes. Those are the four main grains, right? Okay? And each of these group of people display certain kinds of characteristics. So India being a predominantly, as he sees it, okay, certainly the parts of India that he was familiar with. I mean, if he had been more familiar with, let's say, the parts that I come from, North India, well, actually wheat is really the main grain, all right? But certainly Bengal and South India, right, you've got rice. And he argues that in places where rice are grown, you don't need to labor that much to, okay, grow rice. You have to labor more to grow wheat, right? That's what he's saying. And so he's saying there's a relationship between the climate, the soil, okay, the food, and then the qualities that you produce. How industrious are you? How productive are you? What it's going to end up with is this idea of, quote, the lazy native. That's a trope. What's another trope? Oriental despotism. That's a second trope. What's a third trope? Effeminacy. Right? What's a fourth trope? The fanatic Muslim. You know, it was very seldom that you would find the word Muslim in a 19th century English text about Muslims in India and not find the word fanatic before it. It's almost like they were married to each other. You know, if there was a Muslim, he had to be a fanatic. You know, and you can see the roots of this, the consequences of that style of thinking down to the present day. Okay? The Hindu, the Brahmin is always cunning. That's a trope. So what this essay is really good for is for showing you how this trope comes into place. And then you say to yourself, okay, so Orm said this. So what? So did Indians start believing that they were effeminate? Right? I mean, if you really pursued the argument to its logical conclusion, you would have to ask that question, wouldn't you? Because someone would say, well, all right, so Orm wrote this, why shouldn't we just consider him some kind of crank? You know, some kind of nutcase. All right, well, of course, the problem then is that all of them are that way because all of them are going to be dealing with one trope or the other. But that's not sufficient, clearly. We know it's not sufficient because when a body of knowledge is produced about a certain group of people, a certain society, a certain phenomenon, then we have to ask, does this body of knowledge begin to cast its influence in certain kinds of ways? Right? Was in fact effeminacy produced by the discourse itself? All right, so this is where it's becoming very interesting. Because what is the general idea of social science discourse? Social science discourse, most people believe, 99% people believe that what social science discourse does is it captures the reality out there. There's a reality out there. Then the task of the historian, the economist, the anthropologist, whatever the case is to capture that reality through the discipline that they know best. I am suggesting to you that perhaps the more productive way, and that's an immense intellectual challenge because it's going to completely upset all the ideas that we have. The more productive intellectual way to understand this is to say that it's not that this discourse captures that reality, it actually produces that reality. So that what's going to happen is that in the 19th century, we can argue that there are in fact so many Indians who have now internalized, because this is not one essay right here, there are going to be 100 people who are going to be arguing the same thing, right? So if you read the essay on Warren Hastings by Macaulay, which was included in the syllabus, and as I told you, read just 20 pages of it. So what does he say? You know, you look at the Oriental, this, you know, Nand Kumar, what is this? He's an Indian, and what is he doing? All day long, he just takes a bath, you know. Yeah, indolent, corpulent, indolent, Oriental despot, essentially. Right? And there are going to be dozens and hundreds of texts which are going to produce that discourse. And what we find in the late 19th century, for example, is that there are many Indians who are going to say that, you know, we need to have a physical culture. We need to have a physical culture. So there are all these athletic clubs that are going to start to develop, particularly in Bengal, which is supposedly the seat of effeminacy. No one's as effeminate as a Bengali male, according to this conception, right? Okay? So they are going to turn to a kind of a physical culture, the culture of the gym, if I may put it this way, with a vengeance. And if you think that, well, no, that really doesn't make sense, read, for example, Gandhi's autobiography. Gandhi's autobiography. Because one of the things he argues in the autobiography is that when he was growing up, a Muslim friend, in the town where he was growing up came to him and said, hey, have you thought about why are we being ruled by the British? Right? And so Gandhi says, you tell me, why do you think we're being ruled by the British? And then he cites a little doggerel verse, which was very common in those days. And basically this doggerel verse says that one of the reasons we're being ruled by the British is because, hey, we don't eat beef. We're not a beef-eating people. We're a rice-eating people. Right? And Gandhi is saying this idea was widely prevalent. And so his mehtab, his Muslim friend, tells him, you want to become strong, you've got to, you can't become strong eating rice and lentils. Come on. You've got to be a meat eater. And so then Gandhi says, well, for the first time he tried, a piece of goat, and then he heard the goat sort of bleating all night long. And of course he was a strict vegetarian the rest of his life, right? Right, so you see, things that we take, vegetarianism, what is the politics of vegetarianism? That's another long lecture. Okay, but that's how you would get to that. You would start looking at the politics of such things as food and cuisine and its relationship to a particular culture. All right? So this is why this essay is important, because what it does is it establishes a certain trope, right? And then we'll see where do we fit that trope into this large map that I've given you, right, of colonial forms of knowledge. Okay, so I think you had a question.
Yeah, I did. I just wanted to, simplify that. So you're saying that these texts can become self-fulfilling prophecies? So, if you call somebody effeminate enough, they'll eventually... Over
a period of time, yes, it can. Yeah. But I do not want to suggest that they always do that. I'm saying to you that the dominant model of social science discourse everywhere in the world, at this university, everywhere in the world, is that there is a reality out there. Your task as a social scientist is to best capture that reality, describe it. Right? I'm saying to you, frankly, we have to seriously question whether that is how, whether that is the best model for understanding the relationship between the knower and what is known, between the subject and the object. That in fact, the discourse can create that reality. It's not simply capturing that reality or describing it. It creates it. That's what I'm saying to you. Right? But I'm not saying that that will always be the case. There is obviously a gamut of possibilities here. So, but I'm saying that there's one dominant model. Let's now try to see whether we can arrive at a very different understanding. Right? Okay. Any other questions about ORM? All right. So, if you could turn your attention to this here. Right, so I've given you the larger picture now. I've given you the larger picture. Question is, what were the forms of knowledge produced by the colonial state? Right, who produces these forms of knowledge? With what effect? With what consequences? Right, and we've seen illustrations of that. But I want to now go through this systematically, because as I've already suggested to you, from my standpoint, ultimately, the most enduring form, but enduring not here necessarily in the positive sense, right? That the form of conquest that remains is the conquest of knowledge. And this is not particular to the British in India. Let me underscore that again. How do we apprehend the world outside us? We use categories to apprehend the world. Right? We use categories. We classify things. Right? So if you look at a geologist, what looks like just simply rocks to you, to the geologist, you would classify the rocks in different ways. If you were a botanist, you classify plants. And you know the system in the West is the system devised by Linnaeus, right? You classify plants into different ways. Animals are classified. You know, some animals are mammals, some are reptiles, some are amphibians, and then within that you can make distinctions, so forth and so on. These are all forms of classification. Every body of knowledge deals with forms of classification. Now, let's take an example completely remote from that of British India. Let's take the example of Australia, for instance. All right? Now, when the Europeans are in Australia, when Europeans go to Australia, they see a land which is entirely barren almost entirely barren, the way that they see it. And I don't know how many of you have ever been here to Australia, but you know, if you move 50 miles away from the coast, okay, and of course Australia has a huge coastline, right, because it's a continent but to itself and surrounded by water. If you move 50 miles away from the coastline, you start to get into the desert, basically, what's called the outback. I lived in Australia for many months, so I came to know the country quite intimately. And, you know, that's the outback, right? The European sense was, there's nothing there. It's just completely barren. And, of course, the Aboriginals, and there are many different Aboriginal groups, you know, they weren't putting up huge structures, right? Of course, they have a lifestyle. They have a very intimate knowledge of the plants, much more intimate than any European could ever have. And they needed to have that intimate knowledge of plants because they survive on them. So which berries you eat and which you don't, they know it. There is a film, for example. It's a wonderful film. I recommend that very highly. It's called The Tracker. Okay, an Australian film made about 10 years ago. And you know who the tracker was, right? The tracker was, they had that, by the way, among Native Americans too. So the tracker is a person who, so let's say, you know, you're a white prison official, and a prisoner under your charge has escaped. You want to track this man. The problem in Australia is tracking a man who's fled into the outback. How are you going to do it? I mean, you know, and there seems to be no footprints, nothing, you know. Just mile after mile of desert. I mean, you can actually go to a place even today and it'll say next gas station 230 miles, right? Even today, right? So how are you going to do that? So they would hire an Aboriginal tracker because the Aboriginal sees things that you cannot see. You see the ground before you say, right? Nothing. And the tracker sees things that you just cannot see. Because they've been trained. That's the environment that they know. Right? That's the environment that they know. So this film is about this tracker, and he's an Aboriginal, and so he accompanies this white man, and they're tracking somebody down. And the white man is constantly surprised because this man, you know, is able to see things, smell things which he's absolutely clueless about. Okay? So what's the point? The point here is this, that the Aboriginals had a reasonably complex system of knowledge. It's just that their forms of classification were not your forms of classification. They classified animals and plants and minerals. And they had a system of classification, how you deal with this. It was not the system of classification known to the modern West. And of course, from the point of view of the modern West, this was all gibberish. All right? All gibberish. Meaningless, essentially. And to say all of this is not to get completely sentimental and say, okay, it's a political correctness and therefore we have to say that they had complex forms of knowledge. No, I mean, there are people who study these things and we know, okay, exactly what it is that Aboriginal systems of knowledge amounted to. All right? So when the British come to India and are established, it is also clear that in India they are dealing with an extremely complex culture. From the point of view of the British, I'm not saying this is my reading. From the point of view of the British, there's a big difference between being in Africa and between being in India. And the difference, among other things, is that they understand, from their point of view, that the Indians have complex systems of knowledge. They don't think the Africans do. All right? That's their view. But the Indians certainly have complex systems of knowledge, and of course you've got Sanskrit, and then you've got all of these thousands of texts, and at that point they have no comprehension of just how many. It runs into hundreds of thousands, right, of texts. And Sanskrit, and then there are a whole host of other languages, which each of which has literary traditions that, you know, extend to 1,000 years, 1,500 years in some cases. Tamil, extremely old, so forth and so on. So here the task is all the more greater because this is not from the point of view of the British. I mean, some of them, of course, will say it's all nonsense. You remember that passage from Macaulay that I read out to you in class, right, where he says a whole shelf of European literature, one single shelf of European literature is worth more than the entire literature of India and Arabia. Let's throw in Arabia there too, he says. You know, I'm surprised he didn't throw in China or Korea or whatever, you know, right? Right? It's one single shelf is worth more than that entire literature. So yes, there is that arrogance, and there are some people who think that way, but then of course there are others who say that no, in India we're dealing actually with complex systems of knowledge, so why is the task all the more greater? Because what you're doing is you're supplanting those systems of knowledge with your own, essentially. That's what you're doing. Or you're systematizing knowledge in very different ways. Because when we speak about modalities and forms of knowledge, what we're talking about is what are the ways in which knowledge was systematized? Okay? So let's go through this. So historiographic, we've already talked about it, right? That's Robert Orme. That's Alexander Dow. These are all that PowerPoint, the slide I showed you very briefly for 5-10 minutes the other day. You know, okay, the number of works that are produced of history. Okay? Because history is really already, in some ways, the master discipline. That you have to know about your past, and of course the situation today is that you cannot tell a group of people. It might be a group of people, they've got only 10 survivors in the world, you know, belonging to some minuscule linguistic group. Or you go to the Andaman Islands, you know, where there are tribes and there are only 400 members left in that entire tribe in the world. But you cannot tell those 400 people you don't have a history. Everybody has a history. That's part of the protocol of political correctness today, that everybody has a history. Okay, so, but history is becoming the paramount discipline in some ways already, we could say, by the 18th century. What is this discipline going to do? It is going to establish these tropes. Oriental despotism, effeminacy, the idea of the village community, India as a land of ancient institutions, so forth and so on. That's what the historiographic modality is. And it's going to lead to these massive works, history of the Marathas, history of the Sikhs, all in multi-volumes, by the way, almost all of them. Okay? Massive works. I mean, we're talking about dozens and hundreds going into the 19th century. Right? Then you have the observational travel modality. Now this is, you might say, self-explanatory. Right? What is the observational modality? This is the English traveler who comes to India. Okay, and there were certain circuits that you did. So for example, if you go to India today, you know, there's one circuit that about half the tourists will do. Right? For those of you who've been to India, you will know immediately the circuit I'm talking about. It's called Delhi, Agra, Jaipur. It's the Delhi, Agra, Jaipur. So you arrive in Delhi, then you go to Agra. Why do you go to Agra? Taj Mahal, right? Okay, you haven't seen Taj Mahal, you haven't seen India. So Taj Mahal, and then you have yourself photographed there. So everybody, and you know, everybody knows you've been to Taj Mahal, right? And everybody thinks it's unique. They don't realize there are about 5 billion people or whatever who have the same photograph, you know. And now you could just do it on Photoshop. Why do you even have to go there, right? 5 minutes, my daughter can do it on Photoshop, actually. Interesting little twists here about this. So that's that circuit, okay? In those days, what was a circuit? There was a circuit. So you arrived over here. This is Gujarat. I'm talking about circuit number 1. And you work your way down this coast, and then you work your way up this coast, and you land up with the British capital over here, which is Calcutta. Okay, that's circuit number 1. Circuit number 2 is you do it the other way. Because, for example, you want to arrive and be greeted by your fellow Europeans. So then you arrive in Calcutta. If you arrive in Gujarat, well, there are not that many. This is not a real base. Right? So if you want a comfort zone, it's like many young Americans, when they go to Europe for the first time, where do they go? London. Okay, maybe Paris. Right? You're not going to start your grand European trip in Zagreb. If you're an American. You're not. You're not going to start it in some little obscure place, in Europe. You're going to start it in London or Paris. Think about it, right? So that's what's happening here. You start in Calcutta and then you work your way. And if you're a bit daring, you might say, let me go 50 miles interior. Let's see who's there. Are there tribes? Are there savages? Are they civilized? Whatever, right? That's circuit number 2. Then there's circuit number 3. That's the interesting one. And that is, you come to Delhi. Okay? You come to Delhi, the seat of the great Mughal. Remember, the Mughal emperor is still sitting on that throne, albeit it's a throne now. He's a paper tiger and all of that, but he's still got a throne that he's sitting on. And that's, there's all this exoticism, the great Mughal. Because, of course, Mughal Empire, Akbar, the glory of it, all of this is part of what the English are imbibing, the ones who come to India. So you start there, and then you work your way through the Gangetic heartland of India, down the Ganges, on the river, with maybe side excursions here and there, small ones, but this way you will at least come to 2 or 3 major places. One is Banaras. And so there's a standard, sketch of the Ghats of Banaras. And even today, if you look at a National Geographic magazine, and if they have, let's say, traveling in India, the Ghats of Banaras will always be one of the photographs. Okay? The fort in Allahabad, that would be the other one. Right? And then you work your way down to the capital. After 1857, 1858, there's a specialized tour. Okay, why after 1857 and 58? Can anyone make a conjecture? What would that? You remember what 1857, 1858 was? It was the Great Indian Rebellion. So what do you think that tour would be? All the sites associated with the mutiny. You've heard today, right? That whenever there's a disaster, like New Orleans, after Katrina, a lot of people went there. They just wanted to see. This is called disaster tourism. Right? There are all kinds of tourism now. There's skiing tourism, sex tourism, disaster tourism, you name it. Okay? I mean, I could give you a list of 50 of kinds of specialized tourism today. This is mutiny tourism. Right? You want to see where all these episodes took place. You don't know any of the episodes yet because we haven't come to that. But that's going to be your specialized circuit, which is going to develop after 1857-58. Right? And it will be included in all the guidebooks. You must do the mutiny tour, as they say. Right? So it's like Japanese who come to India, they didn't want to really, I'm talking about the 1980s, 1990s. Yeah, India's a bit risky, and Japan's super clean, squeaky clean. Everything works, perfectly. In India, it's the extreme opposite. Nothing works. And therefore, everything works. That's an interesting way to put it, right? But they would come. Why? Because they wanted to go to all the Buddhist sites. So the Indian Railway Ministry developed a special train which would take all the Japanese tourists from one Buddhist site to India. When you finish with that, you get back to Delhi, hop on a plane, and you're back in Japan. You don't want to see the rest of India. You just want to see where the Buddha was born, where he gained his enlightenment, where he preached to his disciples, right? That's what we're talking about over here. So, but what is the observational modality? That these people who are traveling, they're writing travelogues. They're developing a body of knowledge about India. And to complicate this, let me just make one argument. We can't dwell on all of these at extreme length because each of them deserves a lecture on its own. But we're just giving you an illustration of what is involved here. So, what would be one reason? What would be one reason why the British, and when I say the British, I mean some, because the vast majority of them would never leave Britain to come to India. But the ones who did come, why would they be interested in coming to India, you think? Give me a reason, you think. Yes. To do what, sorry?
Like if they weren't content with their own.
If they weren't content with their own life. Okay, although I think you're reading sort of the 1960s, if I may say so, back into the 1780s. You know, all the hippies who went from America, right? Yeah, we are really fed up with Western materialism, you know, the rat race. Let's go to India, smoke some dope, go to the Himalayas. You know, that's contentment. You understand what I mean, right? That yes, I think one always travels to some degree because one is unhappy where one is, to some degree. You know, one might not want to admit that, but you know, you're in a marriage, and the marriage is falling apart. Let's take a trip to the Cayman Islands. Maybe that will help mend our marriage. You know, right? People do that all the time. So I think yes, you're right. But I don't think that was a major reason why they went. Yeah.
Like exoticism.
Exoticism, yeah, true. But I'm looking for, I'm looking for a bit more of a political answer. You should all know that by now, right? That there's always something else there. Yes, exoticism, true. For the same reason that you'd go to Africa, exoticism. You know, you want to see giraffes. You know, the big five animals, as they're called. You know. All right, but what else? Yeah.
Some people who didn't have a name for themselves and very maybe want something.
Well, but you would be going there to establish a career then. Not, I'm talking about travelers. People who go there, well, spend a couple of years there, and then we come back. And remember, this enterprise, there's no innocence here. What is the relationship? To give you a clue as to what I'm looking for, what is the relationship between this modality and the historiographic modality? Okay, yes?
To affirm an idea of racial superiority they've been listening or hearing about me.
To affirm. How would travel be? Okay, so in other words, I see what you mean, that they've heard about it, but now they want to really feel that they are superior. So therefore, when they go, this will confirm them in that view. That's what you mean?
Could be a possibility, yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Not quite bringing back textile, but by considering that we come back with an expertise on a culture of the other, and they could somehow economically benefit.
Yes, okay, that you know, you could go there for 2 years, then you come back, then when you come back to London, you invite your friends for a tea party, and then you can claim to be the expert, right? Yeah, you know, I was there. I actually saw this happen, right? I mean, I went to the Ghats, I saw the women bathing there, or, you know, the men doing this, etc., right? But, yeah, I mean, I think there's a shade of truth in all of these, right? But I think there's something else going on, frankly. Yeah.
What about if it's to perpetuate this idea that they need to be colonized still? Like if you're taking British tourists go there, you know, and they see it and they're like, oh wow, this is nothing like Britain. It's still, you know, it's completely different. It's not nearly developed or anything like that.
Okay, can you push that a bit? You're exactly on the trajectory that I'm interested in, but I want you to push it a bit.
Gaining favor with British citizens that like colonialism in India by showing that it still has a lot left to go, still showing that it's.
But that's a little bit like what we've heard before. You're now going in a slightly different trajectory than the one I'm. So I'll take two more answers and then I'll point out what I think is really happening here. Yeah.
I think when people go to India and they see like it's very undeveloped, they almost see themselves as like, you know, giving them their culture. And it's to a sense of like we're civilizing them.
Yeah, so you develop them.
They need Western society.
Right.
And so when they go and look, they go, oh, like we did so much good by like sharing our culture with them. And it makes them feel kind of okay about themselves.
But you see, the problem with all of these interpretations is that you didn't have to go to India for that. You could be sitting in London or Edinburgh, wherever, and you read James Mill. And James Mill tells you that we are vastly superior, and they have no reason to doubt what he's saying, right? So I'm not utterly convinced that it's that if we get there, then we can really be sure that, we do have a civilizing mission. Yes, there's a little bit of that there, as there is in everything else that's been said. Certainly. that somebody will think that, now I can see for myself why James Mill says that these people are really underdeveloped, right? Or undeveloped altogether. And yes, this gives me, the justification for why we are ruling them. Agreed. There is that element there. But it cannot be, because I'm saying that 99% who didn't travel, and it would be only a small percentage who would travel, right? 99% who didn't travel would feel just that way too, right? So what is the particular specificity of the trip to India? Yeah.
So when you write about it, you have a sense of credibility. You see an expert.
Right, but that's what we talked about, right? That I've been there. I've been there, done it, So you have your tea party when you come back to London and you say, look, I mean, the rest of you, you're just speaking in the abstract. I went there, I know it. So therefore, I'm the authority, right? Essentially.
So maybe it's more when you write about it and you publish these.
Yeah, no, true. Obviously the written word carries some authority, right? It carries some authority, it carries some weight. But I do think that there are other things going on, and I want to. So I'll take one last answer here, and then we'll,
You asked why just people would travel there. I guess I thought it was just because to say that they went, just to say they went.
Right.
It gives them more.
Yeah. And in those days, not many people travel, so you could say that. Today, if you said I went to London. It's like busloads of people are going to London every day. It's packed, the airport, so it doesn't really mean much, right? But back in those days, yes, it might have meant something for somebody to say that, well, I went to India, right? Yeah, I think you had your hand up too, right?
Oh, I was just going to say for the humanitarian idea.
Yeah.
But we pretty much covered that.
Okay. All right, let me suggest to you what I think is happening. I have no way of demonstrating it. I really can't take any more because this is how you end up reading texts, okay, the interpretation I'm going to suggest to you. See, what's 1780, 1800? Take that point. What's happening in England? This is where that unitary field of analysis is important. See, none of you is really giving an answer which is linking up this observational modality, number one, to England itself. To England. What's happening in England? Right? And you're not linking it up to the historiographic modality, that was my clue to you. Try to see if you can link it up. Okay? What's happening in England, the minute I tell you, you'll see that, yeah, that's what's happening there. Industrial Revolution. What does it mean when the Industrial Revolution takes place? Read the accounts. The English landscape changes. Completely changes. You read Dickens, for example, right? First half of the 19th century. Because how does it change? Suddenly you've got mills, chimneys, smoke belching out of them like crazy. Soot all over. You read the accounts. That is what was happening. Now, you're an English writer, jolly good England, right? You're thinking about, the bucolic landscapes. For those of you who've been there, even now it's kind of, bucolic. You go to the Cotswolds, it's like a fairy tale. There are bridges that big. This is the size of the bridge. And little ducks underneath it, right? And you say, oh my God, it's so cute. And then you go to the cottage next door and you have your tea, gently poured Earl Grey. England's so charming, old world, bucolic, romantic. You don't get these gigantic monstrosities like Walmart, just completely littering the landscape, right? Because one American landscape after another looks the same, no matter where you go, right? But in 1800, this is not what it was looking like anymore. And English writers are anguished. English public is anguished. What's happening to England? The England that I knew, it's completely disappearing. Now, how does India come into the picture? You see? And imagine that you wanted to know in 1850, for example. So let's take, now we're talking about the Industrial Revolutions already several decades old. The landscape has completely transformed. You can't recognize England anymore. If you're living in 1850 and you think to yourself, I wonder what England looked like when you didn't have this smoke all over the place and soot, okay, and an urban proletariat class, because one of the things that happens with the Industrial Revolution is the creation of an urban working class. Who's going to work in all of these mills? That's the proletariat, the urban proletariat, the slum dwellers. With the emergence of the Industrial Revolution also will come slums. Right? So you are living in London, or the Cotswolds, Dover, wherever, and you're thinking to yourself, I wonder what England looked like 100 years ago. The only way to find out is to go to India. That sounds strange, doesn't it? No, because this is where temporality comes in. That India is always 200 years behind from this point of view, as it is today from the point of view of some people, right? That you want to see what a bucolic landscape looked like, where life is peaceful, social relations are different. You cannot see it anymore in your own country. You say, let me go to India. Because India today, right, is what England looked like 100 years ago. There's always this displacement, and people still have that feeling. So it's like you talk to people who go to places like India or Pakistan or Sudan or wherever, and they'll say, yeah, it's really astonishing because, I saw bullock carts there. So you see, now what would it mean to have, if you wanted to understand what the European past looked like, when there were only bullock carts, well, go to India today. There's still some places, of course, I'm not saying that in Delhi you'll find bullock carts. Yeah, I mean, you've got Mercedes as well, but you've also got bullock carts. If you ever stop by my office, okay, my front door is plastered with, photographs and, postcards, and I actually have a photograph on my door, and only in India would you find this, and it's a photograph from an Indian newspaper. There's a gas station, right? And so, you pull up your car as you would in America to fill gas. Here, there's a bullock cart at the gas station. What is a bullock cart doing at the gas station? I mean, are you feeding gas into the cow or something, or what? Right? But only in India, right? I mean, it's astonishing, right? And so this is what the traveler is thinking to himself. Yeah, look, and that's where you have to read the text. You see these ruins, and you immediately start thinking of Roman history. That's one thing I have not talked about yet. Critical point, I'm just going to mention it as an aside, that the example of Rome is always before England. Nobody's really worked on that, but this template is there. The English are thinking of themselves in many respects as having the same relationship to India as Rome did to Europe. What did Rome bring? It brought a system of roads and laws, didn't it? Right? So they think of themselves as the new Romans. We are creating an empire in the image of the Roman Empire in India. Right? This argument is going to be widely prevalent. But I'm coming to this, I'm saying that, India is a landscape which now is in some ways reminding you of your multiple pasts, none of which you can comprehend. That's one reason why the museum becomes so important to Western civilization, because it's a way of comprehending your multiple pasts which have been eradicated. The difference is that in those civilizations such as India, you live with multiple pasts. Right? Here, the only way you deal with the past is you eradicate it, and then you put it in a museum where you try to comprehend it. Okay, so I'm going to end on that note, and we will continue this narrative next week.